Welcome everyone to this deep dive into the chemistry of bread. From, like a humble grain to a golden loaf, we're going to unpack 5 fascinating factoids about it that will completely change how you think about, like, that next slice.
I think you'll be surprised how much is going on, like, beneath the surface of something we just kind of take for granted every day.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's just break down the basics. I was reading through the source material, and I was just struck by how much more goes into bread than just combining flour and water.
Yeah, it really is a remarkable interplay of ingredients and reactions. And when we talk about bread chemistry, we really need to start with the 3 fundamental players, right? Gluten, starch, and the byproducts of fermentation.
Okay, so let's unpack those players a little bit. Gluten is the one everyone's talking about these days, right? What makes it so important in bread?
Gluten is absolutely crucial because it provides the structure of the bread. Think of it like a scaffolding that holds everything together. It's a protein that forms a network, giving the dough its elasticity and strength.
Oh, so that's why gluten-free bread often has a different texture. It's missing that key structural component.
Precisely. Now, starch plays a different role. It's the fuel source for the yeast, providing the energy for the yeast to do its work. And as the yeast ferments, it produces byproducts that contribute significantly to the flavor and aroma of the bread.
This is already making me rethink my morning toast. So we've got the structure from gluten, the fuel from starch, and the flavor from fermentation byproducts. But I'm still a bit fuzzy on how those delicious flavors actually develop. What's happening at the, like microscopic level.
That's where yeast fermentation takes center stage. Yeast, these microscopic fungi, consume the sugars present in the dough and release carbon dioxide as a byproduct.
So those carbon dioxide bubbles are what makes the bread rise, creating that airy texture. It's like tiny balloons inflating within the dough.
That's a great way to visualize it. And as the yeast goes about its business, it also produces a variety of flavor compounds that gives bread its, characteristic taste. Different types of yeast and fermentation processes can lead to a wide range of flavors, from the subtle sweetness of a white loaf to the tangy complexity of sourdough.
That makes sense. I've always wondered why sourdough bread has that distinct, almost sour flavor. It seems like the longer fermentation process must play a part in developing those complex flavors.
You're absolutely right. And that extended fermentation has another interesting effect. It directly influences how those carbon dioxide bubbles interact with the gluten network, ultimately shaping the final texture of the bread.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. We've got these tiny yeast organisms producing gas bubbles, and those bubbles are somehow interacting with the gluten structure. What happens next? How does that interaction actually affect the texture of the bread? Okay, so you left me hanging with that cliffhanger. What happens when those carbon dioxide bubbles meet the gluten network?
Well, imagine like a balloon trapped within a net. That's essentially what's happening in your dough. The gluten network, with its like elastic and stretchy nature, traps the carbon dioxide bubbles produced by the yeast, allowing the dough to rise and expand.
So the strength of that gluten network determines how much the dough can rise and how big those air pockets get.
Exactly. That's why different types of flour produce breads with such vastly different textures. Like a high-protein flour, like bread flour, has a lot of gluten, creating a strong and elastic network, that can trap lots of gas. This leads to a chewy bread with those large, irregular holes that we see in sourdough or artisan loaves.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about a flour with less gluten?
A lower protein flour, like cake flour, will create a weaker gluten network, right? This results in a finer, more delicate crumb with smaller air pockets and a softer texture like in a cake or a biscuit.
I'm starting to see how bakers can control the texture of their bread by choosing the right type of flour for the job. But I'm curious about another ingredient that seems pretty basic: water. I mean, it's just water, right? How much impact can it really have?
You might be surprised, water plays a critical role in bread making that goes far beyond simply hydrating the flour. It's actually crucial for the development of that gluten network we've been talking about.
Oh, I'm all ears. How does water help gluten do its thing?
Well, remember, gluten is made up of protein strands, and water allows those strands to move and interact with each other, forming those, crucial gluten bonds. It's like water acts as a lubricant, helping those proteins slide around and link up, creating that strong interconnected web.
So if you don't have enough water, those proteins can't connect properly and the gluten network won't develop as well.
Exactly. Too little water, and you end up with a dense, tough bread. Too much water, and the gluten network becomes weak and loose, resulting in a flat, shapeless loaf. It's all about finding the right balance for the type of bread you're making.
Sounds like bakers need to have a real feel for the dough, almost like an intuitive understanding of how much water is just right.
It definitely takes practice and experience. And there's another factor that comes into play here: Oxidation.
Oxidation. Isn't that what makes apples turn brown? What does that have to do with bread?
It might seem surprising, but oxidation is a crucial process in bread making. When you knead dough, you're incorporating air, and that oxygen in the air starts interacting with the gluten proteins.
So kneading isn't just about mixing the ingredients, it's actually changing the chemistry of the dough.
That's right. This interaction with oxygen helps strengthen the gluten network, making it more elastic and better able to hold those gas bubbles.
That's fascinating. So in a way, kneading is like giving the gluten a workout, helping it build strength and resilience.
I like that analogy. And some bakers even use a technique called autolysis to enhance oxidation.
Autolysis. That sounds intriguing. What is that?
It involves mixing the flour and water and just letting the dough rest for a period usually around 20 to 30 minutes before adding the yeast and salt. This allows enzymes that are naturally present in the flour to break down some of the starches into sugars, which the yeast will later consume during fermentation. It also gives the gluten more time to hydrate and develop that strong network.
So it's like giving the dough a head start, allowing those gluten proteins to relax and get organized before the yeast starts its party.
Precisely. And once the yeast is added and the party gets going, we move on to the next critical stage, proofing.
Proofing, that's when the dough rises, right?
Exactly. This is where the yeast really gets to shine. The dough is left to rest in a warm environment, allowing the yeast to ferment those sugars we talked about and produce carbon dioxide. As those carbon dioxide bubbles expand, the dough rises and develops that light and airy texture we all love.
It seems like there's a lot that can go wrong at this stage. Too short of a rise, and the bread will be dense. Too long, and it might collapse.
You're absolutely right. Proofing is all about finding that sweet spot, that perfect balance of time and temperature. Yeast is a living organism and it thrives in a warm environment, but if it gets too hot, the yeast can die and the fermentation process stops. On the other hand, if it's too cold, the yeast will be sluggish and the dough will rise very slowly.
So bakers have to create the perfect environment for their tiny yeast friends to do their magic. It's like they're running a tiny yeast spa.
That's a great way to put it. And once the dough has proofed to perfection, it's time for the final transformation baking.
I know that's when the magic of the Maillard reaction happens, giving bread its beautiful golden crust. But I'm curious, what else is going on inside the loaf as it bakes?
Well, one crucial process is called gelatinization. You might associate it with making gelatin desserts, but it also plays a key role in bread making. During baking, the heat causes the starch granules in the dough to absorb water and swell.
So they become gel-like, helping to solidify the structure of the bread?
Exactly. This process is essential for creating a soft and moist crumb. Without gelatinization, the bread would be dry and crumbly.
Wow, every step of bread making is a delicate dance of chemistry. I'm starting to see why experienced bakers are often described as having a feel for the dough. They're intuitively understanding these complex reactions and how each ingredient and process impacts the final result.
You're right. It's a combination of knowledge, experience, and a little bit of artistry that goes into making a perfect loaf of bread.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the role of gluten in water to the magic of yeast fermentation and the science behind proofing. What other bread-related wonders await us in the final part of our deep dive? We've journeyed from, humble grain to risen dough. I can't wait to hear what happens in that final baking stage.
It really is the culmination of all those chemical processes we've been talking about. As the heat of the oven penetrates the dough, those yeast cells go into overdrive for one last burst of activity before they die off. That final push of carbon dioxide contributes to what bakers call oven spring, that beautiful final rise you see in the oven.
So even in their final moments, the yeast is working hard to make our bread delicious. But it's not just about the yeast, right? You mentioned the Maillard reaction earlier, the one that gives bread that irresistible golden brown crust. Tell me more about how that works.
Sure, it's a fascinating chemical transformation that involves sugars and amino acids in the dough. When exposed to high heat, these molecules undergo a complex series of reactions, producing hundreds of new flavor compounds.
So it's not just about the color. The Maillard reaction actually creates those complex aromas and flavors we associate with freshly baked bread.
Absolutely. And the intensity of the Maillard reaction can be influenced by several factors, including the baking temperature, the types of sugars present, and even the pH level of the dough.
I'm starting to understand why baking is both a science and an art. Bakers are manipulating these chemical reactions to create, specific flavors and textures. But I have a question. Some breads, like a simple white loaf, taste slightly sweet even if there's no added sugar. Where does that sweetness come from?
That sweetness comes from the starch itself. During baking, some of the starch molecules break down into simpler sugars, like maltose, which contribute to the overall flavor.
So even the starch is adding to the complexity. We've talked so much about creating delicious bread, But what about preserving that deliciousness? How do we prevent our bread from going stale?
Stalling is a natural process, but there are ways to slow it down. It's not just about drying out. The main culprit is something called starch retrogradation, where the starch molecules in the bread realign themselves over time, causing the crumb to become firmer and drier.
Ah, so it's like those starch molecules are getting organized again, but in a way that makes the bread less appealing.
That's a good way to think about it. Freezing is a great way to pause this process and keep bread fresh for longer. It essentially hits the pause button on retrogradation.
I've always been a bit hesitant to freeze bread, but I'm definitely going to give it a try now. But I've noticed that some breads, like sourdough, seem to stay fresh longer than others. Is there a reason for that?
Sourdough's extended freshness is partly due to its lower pH level, meaning it's more acidic. This acidity inhibits the growth of mold and bacteria, which contribute to spoilage.
So that tangy flavor we love in sourdough also acts as a natural preservative. Fascinating.
It is, and the longer fermentation process also plays a role in sourdough's longevity. So there you have it. Bread making is a captivating blend of science, art, and tradition.
I have to say, I am completely in awe of the complexity and the science behind something we often take for granted. From gluten to yeast to starch retrogradation, it's all interconnected.
And understanding these processes not only allows us to appreciate the craft of baking, but also empowers us to become better bakers ourselves.
So the next time you enjoy a slice of bread, take a moment to appreciate the amazing science that went into creating it, and maybe even try your hand at baking your own loaf.
Happy baking! 1018.